name is Karen Wirsig. I'm a labor activist and writer in Toronto, and I'm just here to moderate the panel and give them the time signals. We're going to start with Heather Whiteside, who's an assistant professor at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and Balsillie School of International Affairs Fellow at the University of Waterloo. She's also a board member of Studies in Political Economy at the Center for Global Political Economy at Simon Fraser University, the Political Economy Group at the University of Waterloo, and has published with and or participated in events organized by the Canadian Union of Public Employees, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and the Ontario Health Coalition. And one of her areas of expertise is public-private partnerships and privatization.
I just want to thank you very much for inviting me, for being able to participate in this day. This is a sort of rare and much-needed type of forum. So that being said, so I'm Heather Whiteside. Thanks for the introduction as well. And as you can see from this shameless plug for my book that's also for sale back there, I do research, academic research, hopefully of a general public interest though, on public-private partnerships. P3s is what I'll use to refer to them. This book is specifically about healthcare. I'm increasingly writing about the more financial dimensions. There's a bullet piece that I have that's printed out back there as well, and other stuff, right? So that's me. But using this title about P3s being an insurance policy we don't need and a middleman we don't want, I just want to sort of briefly talk about P3s, even though I'm sure a lot of people in this room are well aware of sort of what they are and how they work, and then I'll talk about some alternatives and whatnot. So we say P3, but the P3s, the public-private partnerships that are most relevant in Canada right now, just to be specific, are the design, build, finance, operate, or maintain infrastructure projects that basically open up public infrastructure and services, the support services associated with that infrastructure, to profit making by and controlled by private partners, right? So there's a debt component and equity component, and I'll talk about that difference in a minute. And then all those contracts are bundled together. They can't be severed, right, legally without renegotiation. And they're several decades long, or in the case of Highway 407, 99 years, right? So basically they can kind of run from a couple generations to in perpetuity, more or less. So this is long-run privatization, but it is privatization by stealth, as someone mentioned earlier. So they're mainly justified on the grounds, this is from the kind of policy side, that they transfer risks from the public sector and the public, right, taxpayers, to the private partner in each of those areas that are bundled, the design, the construction, the financing, the operation. But they actually sell risk, of course, right? So for the private partner to take on the risk, they build that price into the bids, and if they're sophisticated, savvy P3 market participants, as most of them are now, they're pricing risk at a rate that is profitable for them. So this, though, if we think of it as an insurance policy, at least from that kind of public admin, public policy side, is an insurance policy that we really don't need, because we can transfer these risks and have routinely transferred these risks through traditional tendering and contracting. And it's obviously more expensive to transfer risk through a P3 because of that profitability component. So this was also mentioned earlier that the Ontario Auditor General recent report came out saying 74 P3s in this province have added $8 billion unnecessary dollars to the long-run financial obligations of this province. So $8 billion. If the total debt is 10 billion, that's there's another 8 from P3s right there. So even in the normal course of a P3's operations, if the contract is well executed, well designed, in the public interest, the private partners are taking 15 to 20% return on investment there. That I'm going to argue, I hope I have support in this room, that is just completely unnecessary for that to be siphoned off. So in this sense, they're a hidden kind of unnecessary middleman, because it's our public funds that are going to supporting this public infrastructure, and it's our public services. So we have to find ways to just simply cut out the middleman around the finance component in particular. So when you strip away then all the kind of fancy technical lingo around risk transfer, around value for money and whatnot, the funds are coming from our pockets. They're coming either as availability payments paid for the, So there's my map of Canada in case we forgot where we were. And because my research does tend to focus on hospitals, that's what those percentages point out of the total in each of the provinces of P3 projects, you can see how there's been a targeting of public health care. Half of all P3s in BC are hospitals, 2/3 in Ontario, 2/3 in Quebec. And so of the total, I mean, this number keeps increasing every day, right? But 237 at last count, 88 are in the healthcare sector. The other, so about 20% are in transportation and so on. So there's other sectors obviously as well. But healthcare has been targeted. Right, so, but anyway, just on the finance dimension, so it's either user fees that are going to pay for this or availability payments from the government through, tax revenue. So there's really no mystery to it. And the private partners get their financing from mainly institutional investors like pension funds, union pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, superannuation funds, and infrastructure funds set up by Wall Street investment banks. Some component is, are bank loans, but it's really that kind of that institutional investor debt that's driving or financing the P3 market. So we can then, and I'll get to this in a second, hopefully very quickly, we can tap into these sources or similar types of sources to fund public infrastructure and keep it under, public control, democratic control, to whatever extent that's possible. So rather than having the P3 equity, the private partner making money off of that structure, we can create vehicles within the public sector that open up investment for pooled savings like pension funds. Okay, so now if you could switch the slide. Just before I get to that, though, I know I keep promising that, but the design, build, finance, operate P3 is actually increasingly a thing of the past in certain countries, especially where it started. First, places like the UK, just because as infrastructure renewal continues, then there's just no need for projects in those sectors. So I just want to talk about what might be on the horizon here, because this is what's sort of au courant in other countries. So in the UK, I did interviews last summer with Unison. I spoke to people there, the big public sector union. Social impact bonds for them is the new P3. To sort of really summarize what they do for social services, what the design, build, finance, operate P3 does for bridges or hospitals. So it's targeting social services, right? Then in the US, asset monetization is this sort of major model for P3s in fiscally distressed cities like Chicago and Detroit. And so what that does, again, very simply, is sell not the underlying asset itself, but the revenue stream. So the right to the revenue stream of things like public parking meters and parking garages. And then that has turned into a financial asset, which is traded on secondary markets and whatnot, very high risk, in exchange for an upfront lump sum payment to the city, which they then use to pay down debt. But they lose access to their parking meters and public streets and whatnot for the length of that contract, sometimes 99 years. So we have to be on the watch for that. Australia, asset recycling is big there. What it essentially does, and it looks different in different countries, but it takes quote unquote legacy assets like state-owned enterprises, sells them, the revenue is plowed back into P3 infrastructure. So it's a way of opening up kind of new sources of funds and encouraging subordinate levels of government to privatize their state-owned enterprises, like our crown corporations, as a source of funds for new P3s. Okay, so if this sounds familiar, this is part of the justification for the Ontario Hydro share sales. So so here we go. So next slide. These are sort of my cutting out the middleman, list of, some are more practical than others, some are more desirable than others, all have potential problems if hijacked by the wrong people. But I do think that finding an answer or a set of answers to the appeal of private finance, the logic of not taking on public debt, even though it's illusory because P3s are long run obligations, we have to come up with a kind of laundry list to present to privatization supporters. Because that's the government of Ontario's argument. We know P3s are more expensive, but we need to somehow not take on more debt. So here's the kind of range of options that we can present. We know that pension funds and sovereign wealth funds around the world are really eager to invest in infrastructure. These opportunities are always structured, though, as a public-private partnership. There's absolutely no need for that. We could create a public investment vehicle that would be, but again, so the devil will be in the details, but that could be a source or sort of a site for these sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. There really is no shortage of financing out there, especially since 2008 with all the risk that happened in subprime mortgage markets. We do see, this is where we see the investment banks, the kind of Goldman Sachs type things, moving into infrastructure in a really, really big way. And so they're very interested in long run, safe, but high return investment. We don't really want Goldman Sachs investing in our infrastructure, but I mean, I just point out this to say that there's no shortage of funding. So if we come up with creative public vehicles, there's money out there. And we want the government or the democratic sort of populists to be calling the shots to whatever degree possible. So I would suggest then the governments create infrastructure investment opportunities that specifically target pooled savings like capital from credit unions, charities maybe, or some kind of endowments like that, public sector pension funds, Canadian sovereign wealth funds, perhaps wealthy individuals, well-off crown corporations, taking those assets and really using them as leverage rather than selling them, right, to pay off debt. So the Ontario Ministry of Finance reports that the province holds 164 billion in public assets. So 18 billion is government business enterprises like the LCBO, the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Commission, the Ontario Power Generation, Ontario Hydro. So that's 18 billion. Over 85 billion in tangible capital assets like infrastructure Ontario manages. So that could include land as well and buildings, things like that. And then there's another 61 billion that the province owns in investments, cash, other assets. These can be leveraged rather than sold, right? So they're sold, they're gone. So Ontario, though, has a debt service cost of about 10 billion a year. It's the number 3 budget expense. We have to deal with, arguments against selling assets to plug that hole. We could have crown corporations set up in new markets, like if marijuana is legalized, that would be a huge revenue source. We could have new taxes and user fees applied, which would be, for instance, now I know that there's some political dissatisfaction around the idea of applying tolls to public highways. But if we see what the argument was originally with the 407 when Bob Ray was setting it up, was that the tolls would go to pay for the construction. The tolls would be removed once that was paid for. It was turned into a P3 and now we've lost control of the tolls and it's sort of a shambles, I guess, right? But the logic, I think, is still sound, and especially with sustainability concerns and whatnot, intergenerational equity, perhaps having tolls on highways isn't the worst thing in the world, particularly since the gas tax it's a slush fund. It doesn't actually go to road repair at all. So it's really not a solution to transportation revitalization. Or the tolls could be used for other things like public transit. So you toll the highway to pay for public transit. That's an option. I'm just throwing out options. We can obviously debate how appealing these are. We could create a structure for revenue bonds in Canada. We don't really use revenue bonds. This is where you you leverage the future income streams that come from those utilities that the bond is is financing. So public transit, water, hydro, that type of thing. Right now we have usually general obligation bonds, which just relies on property taxes. That's inelastic. It's not a market that is sort of well suited for funding things like individual projects like transit or something like that. So there's the bond thing, and then actually there's getting the federal government to be pressured into more greatly supporting the costs of local infrastructure, using federal bonds, which would be even safer, have much lower interest rates. The debt burden would be far less of a concern. We know Canada's debt burden is not all that significant, relatively speaking. We know that Trudeau has made certain election promises around this. So far, little action, but there have been certain, intimations that there'll be greater federal support. So let's put pressure on that. And then my last point, though, that I'd really like to highlight is the infrastructure bank or trust option, which Trudeau has also suggested during the election would be something that be created. Where will the assets come from that fund the infrastructure bank is a question. But what the infrastructure bank would do is, structured legally as a trust, it can make individual investments in individual projects. It can earn interest. It can create funds for financial investment, like for credit unions or something to invest in. It can circumvent also regular the controls on public sector accounting, which I'll get to in a second, which could be favorable if used right. So. Right, how it's capitalized matters. It can't be that it's the assets coming from the sale of Hydro One that go into this infrastructure bank, obviously. It could be revenue earned from highway tolls, from public transit and water and so on. It could be financed through pooled savings like sovereign wealth funds, superannuation funds, employment insurance, etc. The infrastructure bank itself could float the federal bonds. And really what this would do then is put to rest the arguments in support of private finance once and for all. So there's that dimension. There's also the infrastructure bank, public infrastructure bank, I just want to emphasize, as being a source of expertise in financial transactions, in asset management rather than sale, in real estate and so on, that right now is totally monopolized by private consultants. So that would be another public kind of dimension to it. And last but not least, as I was saying, the infrastructure bank or trust can get around existing accounting rules. So right now, the kind of the federal to provincial rules is that when Ottawa transfers money for provincial infrastructure, it goes on Ottawa's books, it's amortized, even if the province doesn't spend it on infrastructure that year. This discourages quick and dedicated federal funding for provincial infrastructure. With the infrastructure bank, much like the way that CMHC is structured in Export Development Canada, the infrastructure bank can issue interest-free loans, it can do underwriting, it can issue bonds, without owning the infrastructure, without challenging the jurisdiction, like the constitutionally divided jurisdictions that exist in Canada, and so on. So that's my laundry list, and obviously, as I say, each of these could be hijacked, each of these could be a boon, but I'll put them out there for suggestions. Thanks.